You know that feeling when you finally take that vacation you've been saving up for all year?
Oh, yeah. The big escape.
Right. You book the pristine, all-inclusive getaway, the kind that's heavily marketed as an escape where you don't have to lift a single finger,
Where every meal is planned for you.
Exactly. Every excursion is perfectly timed. And yet, the moment you drag your suitcase back through your front door, you collapse onto the couch and realize you are utterly, fundamentally exhausted.
It's a really strange paradox.
It is. Or, consider this one. You pull up your most heavily curated streaming playlist, and despite having access to nearly every piece of recorded audio in human history, every single popular song that surfaces seems to hit the exact same structural beats.
At the precise same second.
Right. Or you travel across oceans to experience a supposedly unique cultural destination, only to find yourself funneled through a gauntlet of souvenir shops. And they're selling the exact same mass-produced keychains you saw on a totally different continent 3 years ago.
Yeah, it is the defining paradox of how we experience leisure and culture today. We actively seek out these experiences with the genuine intention of escaping the daily grind.
We want something authentic.
Exactly, something that breaks the rhythm of our labor. But instead, we end up willingly entering an invisible, highly structured machinery that perfectly mirrors the workplace we were trying to escape in the first place.
It's like we think we are stepping outside the factory walls, but we have essentially just purchased a ticket to a much more aesthetically pleasing wing of that exact same factory.
That is a perfect way to put it. And that invisible machinery is precisely what we are taking a deep dive into today.
Yeah, so for everyone listening, our mission today is to decode this. We all know Theodor W. Adorno as one of the towering, often really polarizing giants of the Frankfurt School, right? One of the big 20th century sociologists.
Right, a massive figure in critical theory.
But today, we want to extract the core insights from a massive stack of sources, including Adorno's original essays, some comprehensive mid-century sociological critiques, and modern academic discourse. And we're going to apply them directly to the systems you and I interact with constantly.
We are going to trace the chronological evolution of his philosophy and use it to decode the modern leisure, entertainment, and global tourism industries.
Because viewing Adorno's really dense sociological theories through the lens of modern tourism provides such a remarkably clarifying framework.
It really does. We're going to trace his intellectual development from his early aesthetic foundations in the 1920s through his exile, all the way to his posthumous works on art and aesthetics.
So we are looking at how a theorist who spent his entire life analyzing the subtle mechanisms of cultural control gives us the perfect vocabulary to understand why, say, the modern cruise ship functions the way it does.
Or the pop charts, or the ecotourism lodge. By applying his critical theory to these spaces you're familiar with, the abstract suddenly becomes incredibly tangible.
So let's jump right in. We all know Adorno's later reputation as the ultimate pessimist of cultural theory, but looking at his early years in Frankfurt really recontextualizes why his critique of bourgeois culture was so piercingly sharp.
Yeah, he was born in 1903, and he wasn't looking at the middle and upper classes from the outside.
Not at all. He was deeply embedded in it.
Deeply. His father was a highly successful, wealthy wine merchant.
And his mother was an accomplished Italian opera singer, right?
Yes. So he is steeped in this environment of immense material privilege and rigorous high European culture from the exact moment he is born. He's
literally absorbing classical music theory at home while subsequently studying philosophy, sociology, and psychology at Frankfurt University.
And he eventually writes his dissertation on Edmund Husserl's phenomenology in 1924.
Which is heavy stuff for a young student.
It is. But that specific combination of influences is the foundational bedrock of his entire critical apparatus. He is simultaneously engaging with neo-Kantian philosophers like Hans Cornelius.
And they were deeply concerned with the structures of human knowledge.
Exactly. And at the same time, he's engaging in these intense formative dialogues with marginal, brilliant thinkers like Siegfried Krakauer and Walter Benjamin.
So you have this synthesis of a wealthy merchant class upbringing and a profound, almost obsessive aesthetic sensitivity to classical music.
And that created a theorist uniquely equipped to dismantle bourgeois culture. He wasn't a jealous outsider throwing stones at the palace.
He was entirely a product of the palace.
Right. He understood its aesthetic comforts, its economic foundations, and most importantly, its moral blind spots from the inside out.
And that insider status makes the trauma of the 1930s even more of a profound intellectual catalyst for him.
Oh, absolutely. With the rise of National Socialism in 1933, Adorno, being of Jewish descent on his father's side and deeply embedded in Marxist intellectual circles, is violently stripped of that comfortable existence.
He's forced into a really harrowing exile. He was first to Oxford and then eventually to the United States.
And the academic consensus in our sources heavily emphasizes that this forced displacement is the crucible that forged his, quote, tragic historical consciousness.
It totally shatters any lingering illusions he might have had about the inherent progress of Western civilization, doesn't it?
Completely. He is brutally torn away from the European intellectual haven that had defined his reality. And from the vantage point of exile, he develops an agonizingly sharp eye for the systemic contradictions of the West.
Because he's watching the exact same civilization that produced the transcendent beauty of Beethoven.
And the rigorous ethics of Kant.
Right, he's watching that same society gleefully descend into the most mechanized, industrialized barbarism in human history.
And that cognitive dissonance permanently colors his theoretical methodology. He realizes that culture and barbarism are not opposites. They are often deeply intertwined.
So applying that concept of displacement to our framework of modern tourism reveals a really staggering contrast for you to think about.
It's a great analogy.
Adorno's worldview is forged by forced exile, right? A traumatic, rootless, violent removal from his home, which strips him of all agency.
Right, he didn't choose to leave.
Contrast that historical reality with the modern phenomenon of the global tourist. The entire tourism industry is built on the commodification of displacement.
Yeah, as tourists, we actively purchase temporary, highly privileged rootlessness.
Exactly. We pay a premium to be uprooted for 2 weeks. We seek out the aesthetic thrill of being a stranger in a strange land, but knowing we have the ultimate safety net of a return ticket.
And Adorno's forced expulsion gave him a hyper-vigilant lens on what it actually means to belong to a culture.
Which makes his critique of how culture is packaged, sanitized, and sold to the modern tourist incredibly devastating.
And that dynamic of packaged culture becomes his primary target when he arrives in the United States.
Yeah, because he's suddenly dropped into the absolute epicenter of mid-century American capitalism.
Places like New York and later Los Angeles.
He's surrounded by the booming industries of Hollywood, commercial radio, and mass advertising.
The culture shock must have been monumental.
I can't even imagine. You take a thinker whose entire psychic foundation is built on the subtle complexities of European high art, and you throw him into the hyper-commercialized machinery of 1930s America.
The immediate intellectual recoil is palpable in his work from that era. I mean, he doesn't look at American mass entertainment and see a democratization of art as many of his contemporaries did.
No, he sees an insidious, totalizing system of control.
Which leads directly into his highly influential 1938 essay.
On the fetish character in music and the regression of listening.
Yes. In that essay, he outlines a mechanical shift in human cognition under capitalism.
So what exactly is this shift?
Well, he argues that the modern listener is being systematically stripped of the ability to comprehend complex, holistic musical structures.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Think about a classical symphony. It operates as a sprawling narrative. To understand the emotional and structural resolution of a symphony, the listener is required to hold the entire architecture of the piece in their mind.
It demands active, sustained intellectual labor.
Exactly. But Adorno observed that mass culture was engineering a regression. Listeners were being trained to abandon the whole and instead latch on to isolated accents.
The shiny hit moments.
Right, the easily digestible superficial melodies.
Right.
He terms this the fetishization and the fragmentation of the musical experience.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that fetish character, because it's a term that is easily misconstrued.
It is, yeah.
In the Marxist and sociological framework he is utilizing, a fetish occurs when the intrinsic worth of a thing, its use value, its internal artistic logic, is entirely eclipsed by its exchange value.
That's exactly the right distinction. You no longer value the piece of music for the profound, organic interplay of the instrumentation or the developmental journey it takes you on.
You value it for the instant, isolated gratification it provides.
Or the social currency it offers. You aren't listening to the song to engage with art. You are enduring the song merely to arrive at the chorus.
The catchy hook.
Because recognizing that hook triggers a reliable hit of dopamine.
So the musical composition ceases to be an artistic expression and becomes a highly engineered commodity designed to deliver that specific neurochemical hit as efficiently as possible.
The parallels to how we consume media today are almost frighteningly accurate.
I mean, we see the total optimization of this in the current era of short-form video platforms. Songs are literally produced to feature a 15-second viral hook.
and the rest of the track is treated as disposable filler.
Right. But translating this regression of listening into our spiral analogy, the regression of experiencing in modern travel, is where Adorno's theory becomes incredibly illuminating.
Oh, the social science application is brilliant here.
Just as Adorno's regressed listener only waits for the catchy chorus of a pop song, ignoring the symphony, the modern tourist frequently ignores the holistic reality of a destination.
They bypass the complex, often contradictory history.
They ignore the socioeconomic realities of the locals, the sprawling urban architecture, all to capture the hit moment.
The visual chorus. The perfectly framed photograph in front of the Colosseum or the Eiffel Tower.
The destination is no longer a living, breathing symphony of human existence. It is reduced to a fragmented, fetishized commodity.
You aren't truly experiencing Paris. You are consuming the isolated concept of Paris to acquire social currency.
The entire city is reduced to a backdrop for a localized transaction.
Furthermore, that fragmentation demands passivity.
How so?
When you only consume the prepackaged fragments, the chorus of the song, the iconic monument, you are relieved of the burden of intellectual labor.
Because the culture industry has completely predigested the experience on your behalf.
Exactly. You don't have to wrestle with the ambiguity or the challenge of the unknown because the meaning has already been assigned and standardized before you even arrived.
That concept of predigested meaning serves as the perfect bridge into the absolute bedrock of the Frankfurt School's philosophical project.
Yes, moving to 1947.
Right. During his American exile, Adorno co-authors a Dialectic of Enlightenment with Max Horkheimer. And our sources universally point to this text as the foundational document of what we now call critical theory.
But to fully grasp the weight of this book, we really have to isolate how critical theory fundamentally breaks away from traditional positivist sociology.
Yeah, the methodological divergence is profound. So traditional positivist social science operates on the assumption that it can describe society objectively.
It attempts to study human social structures with the same detached neutrality that a physicist applies to studying atoms.
It gathers empirical data, runs statistical analyses, and claims a value-free neutrality. It assumes the researcher is just a detached observer.
And critical theory fundamentally rejects that premise. It constantly interrogates the underlying social, economic, and historical conditions that produce the theory itself.
It acknowledges that the scientist making the measurements is hopelessly tangled in the very web they're trying to measure.
Precisely. You cannot achieve pure objectivity because the conceptual tools you use to measure society were built by that same society.
So critical theory demands a relentless reflexivity.
Yes, we must continuously analyze the historical and economic forces that shape our very cognitive ability to perceive the world.
And when Adorno and Horkheimer apply that relentless reflexivity to Western history in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the thesis they arrive at is exceptionally dark.
Very dark. They target the Enlightenment, the historical epoch traditionally celebrated as humanity's triumph over myth, superstition, and fear through the application of reason and science.
And they argue that this very movement carried the seeds of its own catastrophic inversion.
They trace how reason, which was supposed to be a tool for human liberation, mutated into instrumental reason.
Instrumental reason. So society stopped interrogating the philosophical why behind our actions, the ethical ends, and became exclusively obsessed with the how.
The efficiency of the means. When you deploy instrumental reason to master and dominate nature-extracting resources, building industrialized systems, that logic of domination inevitably turns inward.
The same mechanisms used to control nature are inevitably deployed to control human beings.
The machinery built for liberation seamlessly transforms into the machinery of oppression, culminating, in their view, in the mechanized horrors of the mid-20th century.
To articulate this complex historical shift, they utilize one of the most enduring allegories in modern philosophy.
Yeah.
And they pull it directly from ancient Greek mythology.
The Odyssey.
Yeah, they look at Homer's Odyssey not just as a poem, but as the mythological prototype of the modern bourgeois individual.
And the specific scene they isolate is Odysseus sailing past the island of the Sirens.
So the mythological premise is that the siren song is so intoxicatingly beautiful, so fundamentally tethered to the wild, unrestrained forces of nature that any sailor who hears it will lose their mind.
They'll steer their ship into the rocks and perish.
Right. Now, Odysseus, representing the modern rational mind, wants to experience the aesthetic thrill of the song, but he fundamentally refuses to die for it.
So he devises a structural solution.
He orders his crew to plug their ears entirely with beeswax so they are deaf to the music, and then commands them to tie him securely to the ship's mast.
The structural analysis Adorno and Horkheimer apply to this scene is just breathtaking. They ask, what is the function of the mast?
It's the physical manifestation of rational self-control.
It is the ego violently chaining down the primal urges of the body. Odysseus hears the beautiful, chaotic, intoxicating music of nature and pure pleasure, but he is physically restrained from acting upon it.
He has institutionalized the postponement of his own pleasure for the sake of mere survival.
They argue this is the mythological birth of capitalist work discipline. You must systematically repress your desires, chain yourself to the rigid structures of the economic system, simply to survive the journey of life.
Applying this mythological framework to the spatial reality of the modern all-inclusive resort, or the massive industrialized cruise ship, yields an incredibly powerful critique of how we experience leisure.
It really maps perfectly.
The modern tourist is entirely Odysseus. When you book passage on a mega cruise ship, you are essentially paying to be tied to the mast of a hyper-controlled, pre-packaged, temporally rigid itinerary.
You stand on the deck of this massive floating apparatus of safety.
And you are permitted to gaze out at the wild, the exotic, the dangerous local cultures and ports of call, which function as the sirens.
You are consuming the visual aesthetic of adventure while being completely insulated from any of its actual risks or transformative potential.
You hear the song, but your interaction is entirely passive. You view the exoticism from behind the tinted glass of an air-conditioned luxury tour bus.
Or from the elevated railing of the ship's upper decks.
You are restricted by the iron discipline of the tourism industry schedule. You cannot spontaneously abandon the ship and disappear into the local reality because you are chained to the mast of the 4:00 p.m. buffet schedule and the departure time.
The system allows you to flirt with the illusion of freedom while ensuring you remain entirely captive to the commercial structure.
It is the ultimate curation of experience.
The danger and the beauty of the unknown are neutered, packaged into a 45-minute excursion, and sold back to you as a safe commodity.
But the allegory extends further, doesn't it? Into the realm of class structure.
Yes. If the tourist is Odysseus, suspended in a state of restrained aesthetic consumption, we have to look at the crew.
The rowers. The laborers whose ears are plugged with wax.
Within the logic of the text, the rowers represent the proletariat, the working class whose labor physically propels the ship forward.
Their ears are sealed with wax, meaning they are systematically denied even the restrained aesthetic pleasure that Odysseus enjoys.
They are alienated from the beauty of the sirens and the culture surrounding them. Their sole function is to keep their heads down and maintain the mechanical rhythm of the oars.
They look up and see their master, Odysseus, writhing in the agony and ecstasy of the art, but they themselves are locked out of the cultural experience.
In the context of the cruise ship, these are the thousands of unseen staff members below deck working grueling shifts in the engine rooms and industrial kitchens,
keeping the machinery of leisure functioning so that the tourists above can consume the illusion of escape.
It's a devastatingly bleak architectural mapping of class and consumption.
And that mechanism of mass consumption is expanded upon in the most famous chapter of Dialectics of Enlightenment, focusing specifically on the culture industry, Enlightenment as mass deception.
This is where Adorno takes the concept of the controlled ship and maps it onto the entirety of mass media. He coins the term culture industry to describe how radio, cinema, jazz, and mass market publishing operate.
He vehemently rejected terms like popular culture, didn't he?
He did, because that implies a culture arising organically from the people. Instead, he argued that the culture industry is an immense top-down illusion machine.
It standardizes artistic expression into tools of mass deception and social control.
And the source material highlights his concept of false newness, which is incredibly perceptive.
The culture industry constantly churns out products that project the illusion of novelty, but the variation is entirely superficial.
It is simply different aesthetic costumes draped over the exact same standardized structural skeleton.
You see this constantly. The algorithmic structural beats of every massive superhero blockbuster, the predictable narrative arcs of romantic comedies, the mathematically identical chord progressions in the top 40 pop hits.
And this standardization serves a profound psychological function, creating what Adorno terms the ideology of identification.
Right. So when the audience consumes these standardized narratives, when you watch the formulaic movie and feel a rush of satisfaction as the protagonist overcomes a predictable obstacle, you are being trained to identify with the product.
And by extension, you are internalizing and accepting the societal status quo.
The culture industry promises you genuine emotional catharsis and fulfillment. but its structural imperative is to systematically deliver only postponement.
It provides just enough of a superficial thrill to ensure you return to the theater or keep scrolling through the app, but it fundamentally refuses to resolve your underlying alienation.
It operates on a cycle of perpetual, unfulfilled desire to get the machinery of consumption running infinitely.
The physical manifestation of this false newness in our tourism framework is the global tourist trap.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the spatial layout of any major tourist hub globally. A market in Bali, the souvenir stands enveloping Times Square, the shops surrounding the Colosseum in Rome.
Despite being separated by thousands of miles and vastly different cultural histories, they are selling the exact same standardized commodities.
The mass-produced refrigerator magnets, the shot glasses, the cheaply printed t-shirts.
The only actual variable is the font spelling out a different city's name.
It is the identical structural skeleton in a geographically specific costume.
Mm-hmm.
And as a tourist, you purchase these items under the illusion that you are individualizing your experience,
capturing a unique memory of a specific place.
when in reality, you are participating in a highly standardized, globally industrialized formula of consumption.
Which naturally leads to a profound psychological question that Adorno had to address.
Why do we consent to this?
Exactly. If the system is so transparently manipulative, delivering only false newness and postponement, why do populations so eagerly embrace the standardized commodity?
Why do we actively crave the rigid structure of the cruise ship and the predictable beats of the pop song?
This psychological puzzle drove his work when he returned to a devastated Germany in 1949.
Right. So in 1950, he co-authors a monumental empirical sociological study titled The Authoritarian Personality. And he's working alongside researchers Sandfood, Frankel-Brunswick, and Levinson.
They were attempting to decode the psychological bedrock of fascism.
They wanted to understand the mechanics of how seemingly ordinary everyday citizens became not just compliant, but enthusiastic participants in highly oppressive authoritarian regimes.
To operationalize this question, they developed the F-scale.
The fascism scale.
Yes, it was a pioneering psychometric tool designed to measure a specific constellation of psychological traits that they hypothesized formed an authoritarian character structure.
They were analyzing traits like rigid conventionality and inflexible adherence to middle-class values and norms.
They measured authoritarian submission, which is an uncritical, eager subservience to idealized moral authorities.
They also looked at superstition, a destructive cynicism, and an intense preoccupation with power, dominance, and toughness.
Our sources note that this study was a unique methodological hybrid. It attempted to seamlessly blend the deep qualitative insights of Freudian psychoanalysis with the quantitative rigors of empirical sociology.
So the underlying psychoanalytic premise of the F-scale was identifying individuals who possessed a deep-seated psychological need for rigid hierarchy to manage their own internal anxieties.
They hypothesized a character type that derives intense psychological security from submitting to a perceived higher authority, while simultaneously finding a cathartic release in dominating or crushing anyone they perceive as falling below them in the social strata.
It is the complex psychology of simultaneously punching down while kissing up, utilizing hierarchy as a defense mechanism against the ambiguity and complexity of the modern world.
Now, when we look at the methodology detailed in our sources through the lens of modern political science, it is important to acknowledge the subsequent academic critiques of this specific study.
Yes, we need to be very clear here. We're not taking any political sides. We are merely reporting the findings and the subsequent academic critiques as detailed in the source text, reflecting the evolution of political science.
Right. Contemporary scholars point out a structural limitation in the original F-scale. They note that it was designed in a way that exclusively measured right-wing authoritarianism.
It essentially failed to account for or measure parallel authoritarian or dogmatic tendencies that could exist on the left of the political spectrum.
Recognizing that methodological evolution is crucial when looking back at the history of the social sciences.
Absolutely. The tools of social science are constantly subjected to historical and methodological reevaluation. However, if we look past the specific political mapping of the 1950s and isolate the core psychological dynamic Adorno was trying to illuminate, the deep, anxiety-driven desire for rigid structural hierarchy, we see micro-manifestations of this behavior everywhere in daily life.
We see it incredibly clearly in group dynamics, particularly in guided tourism or the hospitality industry.
Oh man, anyone who has ever observed a group tour or worked the front desk of a hotel has encountered this exact character structure in the wild.
It is the individual who becomes visibly anxious if the itinerary deviates by even 5 minutes.
demanding an absolute, unyielding adherence to the published schedule. They display an extreme, almost performative deference to the tour guide, the individual holding the clipboard representing the established authority.
Yet the moment a minor inconvenience occurs, that same individual becomes highly demanding, arrogant, and verbally aggressive toward the service staff, the waiters, or the local vendors.
They desperately need that rigidly defined hierarchy, knowing exactly who they must obey and who they are permitted to abuse in order to feel safe in an unfamiliar environment.
It's a very sharp application of the theory. The compulsion to categorize every human interaction into a strict binary of above me and below me is a mechanism for managing the overwhelming sensory and cultural data of an unfamiliar environment.
When the ego cannot tolerate ambiguity or the fluidity of genuine human connection, it rigidly attaches itself to the rules and the power structures provided by the institution.
And Adorno was intensely aware of how these overarching systems of control fractured and damaged the individual's psyche on a micro level.
Which brings us to 1951. He publishes Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life.
According to our sources, this is widely considered his most intimate, literary, and deeply personal work.
It departs entirely from the structure of a dense sociological treatise. Instead, it is composed as a collection of fragmented aphorisms, brief reflections, and intensely focused micro-observations.
The title itself is a masterclass in melancholic irony. It is a direct, mocking inversion of Aristotle's ancient ethical treatise, Magna Moralia, which translates to the great morals or the grand morality.
By titling his work Minima Moralia, Adorno is positing that in the era of late capitalism and industrial administration, a grand morality, a universal, cohesive system of ethical living, is mathematically impossible.
The totality of the world is too fundamentally fractured. The best the modern individual can hope for is a minor morality, an agonizingly close examination of the everyday fragments of our lives.
He applies this intense analytical focus to the most mundane, overlooked objects and interactions. He analyzes the design of modern doorbells, the spatial arrangement of living room furniture, the shifting cadence of how we close doors or speak to one another.
Treating these microphenomena as precise indicators of how the macro society is malfunctioning.
And out of this text emerges one of his most devastating, frequently quoted axioms. Wrong life cannot be lived rightly.
Wrong life cannot be lived rightly. The emotional weight of that statement is profound, but it is driven by a rigorous, unyielding logic.
He is arguing that individual ethical salvation, the achievement of total moral wholeness, is a structural impossibility.
The individual does not and cannot exist in a vacuum. Your daily choices, your physical environment, your very psychological architecture are already pre-shaped, compromised, and damaged by the oppressive, overarching totality of the capitalist system.
You cannot carve out a purely ethical, righteous existence if the economic bedrock and the social air you breathe are fundamentally unethical. The poison is in the groundwater.
Applying this uncompromising logic to the modern trend of ecotourism or ethical travel completely shatters the marketing narrative of the industry.
We're currently seeing a massive surge in consumers wanting to travel, but desperately wanting to alleviate the guilt associated with it.
So the industry provides workarounds. You book the sustainable eco lodge built from reclaimed wood, you pay the carbon offset surcharge on your flight, you purchase the fair trade artisan coffee in the resort lobby.
The consumer asks, can I have an authentically moral vacation?
And if we channel Adorno's rigorous methodology, the answer is an unequivocal no. He would adapt his own axiom. Wrong travel cannot be traveled rightly.
Because the entire foundational infrastructure of global aviation and international hospitality is inextricably linked to massive carbon emissions, historical wealth disparity, and the relentless commodification of vulnerable local cultures.
We cannot magically absolve ourselves of that systemic guilt simply by purchasing a slightly greener ticket or using a paper straw.
The overarching system of globalized leisure is itself the wrong life.
But tracing this logic out to its endpoint often leaves people feeling completely paralyzed.
Yeah, if every choice is compromised, if the wrong life cannot be lived rightly, what is the point of critique? Should we just resign ourselves to the machinery, sit in a dark room, and refuse to participate in society?
That is the most common emotional reaction to reading Adorno, but it misinterprets his ultimate goal. He is not advocating for nihilism, despair, or paralysis.
He is advocating for a brutal, rigorous honesty.
He is demanding that we stop pacifying ourselves with the cheap, feel-good solutions offered by the very systems that created the problem.
The eco-friendly plane ticket, in his view, is just another sophisticated product from the culture industry, meticulously designed to soothe your ethical anxiety and ensure you continue consuming.
Adorno insists that we must stay awake to the agonizing contradictions of our reality. Acknowledging that we are living a damaged life is the agonizing but absolute first step toward resisting it, which is vastly preferable to blindly conforming to the narcotic illusion that everything is fine.
We must force ourselves to look directly at the mechanics of the machinery, even when the glare is painful. And his insistence on how we should study that machinery led to a massive decade-long academic battle.
Moving into the late 1950s and 60s, Adorno is now the director of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt.
And from 1961 to 1969, he is the central figure in a sprawling intellectual conflict known as the Positivism Strait, or the Positivism dispute.
Engaging in fierce methodological debates, primarily with Karl Popper and later Hans Albert.
This was not just an academic squabble. It was a battle for the very soul and function of sociology.
We touched on the roots of this earlier when discussing critical theory. The positivists argued that the social sciences should closely emulate the natural sciences.
They believed sociology should be strictly value-free, entirely objective, and grounded solely in empirical data, formal logic, and falsifiable hypotheses. You measure the society, you record the data, you remain neutral.
Adorno completely and vehemently rejected this epistemological framework.
Which can be a difficult concept to grasp initially, because in our modern world, we treat data as the ultimate arbiter of truth. Data is supposed to be objective. Why does Adorno view data-driven neutrality as a threat?
Because he recognized that a human society is not a static, physical object like a geological formation or a chemical compound that can be neutrally measured from an external vantage point.
Society is a wildly contradictory, historically fluid totality.
It is dripping with historical trauma, unseen power dynamics, and deep irrationalities. If you attempt to reduce the immense complexity of human suffering and social structures purely to manageable data neat little numbers on a spreadsheet, you are violently stripping away the nuance.
The historical context, and the qualitative reality of the human beings involved.
Furthermore, by treating the current status quo of society as a neutral fact to be measured, rather than a historically constructed problem to be solved, you are implicitly legitimizing the oppressive structures that generated those facts.
You are passively accepting the world as it currently exists, rather than critically interrogating why it was built this way and who it serves.
The application of this methodological critique to modern tourism boards and municipal governments is incredibly revealing.
The entire language of global tourism management is fundamentally positivist. City governments release these highly polished annual reports that are purely data-driven.
We successfully attracted 2.5 million visitors this fiscal year. We increased local tourism GDP by 4.2%. Hotel bed occupancy peaked at 88%.
The data is presented as neutral, undeniable proof of a massive systemic success.
But critical theory demands we ask, what qualitative realities is that quantitative data actively obscuring?
It obscures the entire structural reality of the city. Adorno would view those GDP metrics as a sophisticated smokescreen.
That data completely ignores the violent social contradictions playing out on the ground.
It doesn't measure the rampant gentrification that displaced multi-generational local families to clear zoning for luxury short-term rentals.
It doesn't quantify the environmental degradation of the local water supply.
It certainly doesn't measure the psychological alienation of the local working class who are now forced to serve those 2.5 million visitors while being priced out of their own neighborhoods.
True sociology, true critical theory must tear away the veil of positive data to expose those underlying messy, painful contradictions rather than just triumphantly counting the hotel beds.
Exactly. When you rely solely on the data, you are actively participating in what Adorno identified as identity thinking.
And that concept is the foundational pillar of his most complex and systematic philosophical work, Negative Dialectics, published in 1966.
Our sources highlight Negative Dialectics as the philosophical climax of his career. It is a dense, sprawling critique of the entirety of Western philosophy's reliance on identity thinking.
Taking direct aim at the epistemological systems of giants like Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel.
To really ground this for everyone listening, we need to carefully unpack the mechanics of this concept. What exactly is identity thinking?
Well, to understand identity thinking, we have to look at how human cognition traditionally operates. In Western philosophy, we navigate and attempt to master the chaotic world by utilizing concepts.
We observe a complex object or a phenomenon and we apply a label to it. We categorize it.
We say, this object is a tree, or this system is a democracy. Identity thinking operates on the fundamental, often unconscious assumption that the conceptual label we apply perfectly and fully encapsulates the total reality of the object.
We assume an absolute identity between the concept in our mind and the object in the world.
We conflate the word with the totality of the thing itself.
Precisely. But Adorno argues that this is an incredibly dangerous epistemological illusion. A concept can never fully, exhaustively capture the reality of an object.
There is always a remainder. There is always a chaotic, complex aspect of the reality that refuses to fit neatly into our designated conceptual box.
He terms this uncapturable remainder the non-identical.
The non-identical is the messy, irreducible reality that bleeds outside lines of the label.
Yes. And the core argument of negative dialectics is a plea for the priority of the non-identical.
Because when the logic of identity thinking forcibly coerces objects, or more dangerously, human beings and entire societies, into rigid, uncompromising categories, it must actively suppress, ignore, or destroy whatever doesn't fit the mold.
Adorno identifies this conceptual coercion as a form of epistemological violence. You are erasing the nuanced complexity of the real world to force it to comply with your theoretical framework.
And the terrifying historical leap Adorno makes is recognizing that this epistemological violence, the obsession with categorizing and purging the non-identical in thought, inevitably paves the way for literal physical violence and political domination in the real world.
Which brings us to the most famous and perhaps most heavily debated reflection in the entire text. His questioning of whether philosophy or art is even morally possible after Auschwitz.
This is where the infamous quote originates: "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric."
That quote is frequently misinterpreted as a literal demand to cease all artistic production.
But Adorno is posing a much more profound, agonizing question. He's pointing out that the hyper-rational, categorized identity thinking of Western civilization, the exact same philosophical lineage that produced Kantian ethics and the Enlightenment, ultimately provided the structural logic for the industrialized, categorized, bureaucratic slaughter of Auschwitz.
If our most cherished concepts of reason and progress structurally facilitated that level of barbarism, how can we possibly trust that same culture and philosophy going forward?
If our intellectual tools are stained with that violence, how can we continue to wield them without interrogating them down to their very foundations?
It is a chilling historical indictment. And while it is obviously operating on a vastly different scale of historical stakes, we can observe the mundane mechanics of identity thinking operating seamlessly in our modern leisure systems.
The concept of the tourist gaze is a perfect manifestation of this.
When a global travel conglomerate or a glossy magazine labels a complex, ancient, living metropolis merely as a romantic getaway or the ultimate party capital, they are actively engaging in identity thinking.
They're forcibly trapping the sprawling, contradictory reality of that location into a neat, easily consumable conceptual box, a two-dimensional postcard.
And we must ask, what is violently excluded from that conceptual box?
The non-identical.
The messy, unmarketable reality of the people who actually live there. The systemic poverty located just 2 blocks behind the luxury resort. The ongoing political and labor struggles of the citizens.
None of those realities fit into the rigid, marketable concept of the romantic getaway, and so they are conceptually erased, rendered invisible to the tourist.
Negative dialectics demands that we actively resist that conceptual erasure. It asks us to constantly search for and validate the non-identical, to resist the cognitive comfort of putting a neat bow on a complex reality.
But resisting that cognitive comfort is incredibly exhausting work. The human brain is hardwired to categorize. We desire the easy answer to reduce cognitive load.
The culture industry understands this neurological vulnerability perfectly, and it constantly feeds us those easy prepackaged answers.
So the ultimate question becomes, where do we find the tools to resist this totalizing system? For Adorno, the last remaining bastion of truth was found in art.
But not all art. He demanded a very specific, fiercely difficult kind of art.
Which brings us to his posthumous 1970 masterwork, Aesthetic Theory, and his deeply integrated sociology of music.
Aesthetic theory is a fascinating defense of the radical autonomy of art, and he is essentially fighting a two-front intellectual war here.
On one flank, he is attacking the bourgeois concept of art for art's sake. The idea that art is just a pretty decoration completely divorced from societal realities.
But on the other flank, he is equally hostile to socialist realism, art that functions merely as direct political propaganda, where a simplistic message is hammered into the audience's head.
Adorno posits that authentic art must maintain a delicate, agonizing dialectical tension. Because art is physically and historically produced by society, it inherently contains the truth and the contradictions of that society.
However, it must never express this truth through direct, literal representation or crude political slogans.
Yeah.
True art expresses the underlying reality of society entirely through its internal form.
Our sources highlight two crucial German philosophical concepts he uses here. Schein, meaning appearance or illusion, versus Wahrheitsgehalt, meaning truth content.
Art is fundamentally an illusion, a constructed appearance. But locked within that formal illusion, it contains a profound truth content that cannot be articulated in the degraded instrumental language of everyday life.
To truly grasp how this functions, we have to look chronologically at his specific writings on music, where his theories are most rigorously applied.
In his 1949 work, Philosophy of New Music, he sets up a massive comparative analysis between two towering composers, Arnold Schoenberg and Igor Stravinsky.
He aggressively champions Schoenberg and subjects Stravinsky to a devastating critique. The reasoning is entirely rooted in musical form.
Schoenberg pioneered the 12-tone technique, right? A method of composition that completely shattered the traditional rules of Western musical harmony.
Traditional music relies on a tonal center, a home key that provides the listener with a sense of narrative comfort and inevitable resolution.
Schoenberg's technique ensures all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are sounded equally, destroying that tonal hierarchy.
The resulting music is intensely difficult, disjointed, and often actively unpleasant to the untrained ear. And Adorno believed it was a masterpiece of truth.
Because it fundamentally refused to play by the rules of the culture industry.
Exactly. By destroying the soothing, predictable resolutions of traditional harmony, Schoenberg's radical, disjointed form truthfully mirrored the fragmentation, the anxiety, and the unresolved alienation of modern capitalist life.
It refuses to soothe the listener. It forces you to remain perpetually suspended, anxious, and actively engaged.
Stravinsky, conversely, was experimenting with neoclassicism, reverting to older, established musical forms. Adorno viewed this as a reactionary fake comfort, a musical lie that masked the true horror of the modern condition.
We see a similar logic in his 1960 work, Mahler, a musical physiognomy, where he praises Mahler's symphonies specifically because they are intentionally flawed.
They are full of sudden interruptions, vulgar quotes, and structural collapses that refuse to offer a seamless, false unity.
So radical, fractured forms of art, whether we're talking about Schoenberg's abrasive 12-tone compositions, or the absurd, fragmented, agonizingly repetitive plays of Samuel Beckett, whom Adorno also deeply admired, are the only mediums capable of truthfully representing our damaged world.
They possess a built-in defense mechanism against the culture industry. They actively resist easy consumption.
You physically cannot put Schoenberg on as relaxing background music while you answer emails or sit by the pool.
The form itself demands your full, uncomfortable, undistracted attention.
And in a society entirely engineered to make you passively consume the hits, forcing the brain into active, uncomfortable engagement is the ultimate act of intellectual resistance.
It has been a truly staggering intellectual journey unpacking his thought process, but our deep dive requires us to rigorously examine the pushback against his theories.
Adorno passed away in 1969, leaving behind a massive, complicated legacy. He deeply influenced the next generation of thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, who sought a more optimistic route out of the trap through communicative rationality.
As well as Axel Honneth's theories of recognition and the brilliant Marxist cultural critic Frederick Jameson.
However, his work also attracted fierce foundational critiques.
The critiques are substantial and strike at the core of his methodology. The source text outlines several major areas of contention.
First, we have the critique spearheaded by cultural studies pioneers like Stuart Hall, who took aim at what he perceived as Adorno's blatant, unrepentant elitism.
Hall and others argued that Adorno's view of the masses was condescendingly monolithic. They argued that everyday audiences are not the passive, brainwashed zombies the culture industry theory implies.
Audiences actually possess agency. They have the capacity to actively negotiate with popular culture, to subvert its intended meanings, and to forge genuine resistant identities, even out of mass-produced commodities.
We see that constantly in modern media. Fan fiction communities entirely rewriting mass-market narratives to represent marginalized voices, or the punk movement taking mass-produced instruments and 3 standardized chords to create a genuine cultural rebellion.
Precisely. The second major line of critique targets his overwhelming pessimism. Critics argue that his theoretical framework is essentially a beautifully constructed dead end.
If the capitalist system is truly a closed, totalizing loop that instantly co-opts every form of rebellion into just another product, then he leaves absolutely no room for political agency, collective action, or practical resistance on the ground.
Then there is the unavoidable critique of his stylistic difficulty. His writing is famously, almost belligerently obscure, utilizing spiraling dialectics, dense jargon, and refusing to provide clear summaries.
Many argue this simply isolates his philosophy in the ivory tower.
And finally, modern academic critics point out that his macro-level theories struggle significantly to accommodate the nuances of intersectionality.
He tends to theorize the subject in very broad, universal terms, which often obscures the highly specific, concrete experiences of different marginalized groups based on race, gender, or colonial history.
But as we synthesize all of this, I think it's crucial we engage in some original evaluation of these critiques. Because when you look at the totality of his work, there's a very powerful defense to be made, particularly regarding the accusations of elitism and his stylistic difficulty.
I think connecting those two specific critiques reveals a very different Adorno. What Stuart Hall and others label as elitism, his refusal to validate mass pop culture, could actually be interpreted as a profound, uncompromising respect for the ultimate capacity of the human intellect.
Think about the mechanics of the culture industry we discussed. It fundamentally treats the consumer like a child.
It feeds you easily digestible sugar. It dictates exactly how you're supposed to feel through swelling orchestral cues. And it meticulously ensures you never have to strain your cognitive faculties.
It is, to borrow our earlier analogy, the all-inclusive resort of thought.
Adorno flatly refuses to participate in that infantilization. By refusing to hand the reader easily consumable summaries, by deliberately writing in a difficult, spiraling, dense style that forces you to read a single paragraph 3 times just to unpack the syntax, he is actively demanding that you wake up.
That is a phenomenal deduction. His difficult writing style is not a failure of communication. It is a deliberate, formal choice.
Just like Schoenberg's abrasive 12-tone music, his syntax is an act of formal resistance against the easy consumption of the culture industry.
He is forcing the reader into a state of active, laborious participation.
He is essentially communicating through his form. I respect your cognitive abilities far too much to serve you a pre-digested lie. You are going to have to work for this truth.
Regarding the critique of his absolute pessimism, our source text utilizes a phrase to describe his philosophy that I think is incredibly beautiful and accurate. It refers to his worldview as a form of negative hope.
In a world drowning in false positivity and standardized happiness, demanding truth, refusing to accept the cheap plastic illusions we are endlessly sold, is in itself the ultimate act of intellectual defiance.
It isn't a surrender to despair. It is a stubborn, unyielding refusal to settle for anything less than genuine freedom.
It is the insistence that the alienation and the pain we feel within this highly administered system are real, valid responses, and that fully acknowledging that pain, rather than medicating it with pop culture, is the only mechanism left to keep the conceptual possibility of a better world alive.
That brings us to the end of a truly massive intellectual expedition. We have traced Adorno's evolution from a world of aesthetic privilege in Frankfurt through the profound trauma and clarity of exile into a lifetime dedicated to uncompromising critique.
We've unpacked how he dismantled the comforting illusions of the culture industry, warned us against the cognitive regression of our listening habits, and utilized the mythology of the Odyssey to perfectly map how we remain chained to the mast of modern capitalism, even in our leisure.
We explored his defense of difficult art, and how, even when trapped within a damaged life, he demanded rigorous, agonizing honesty over comforting lies.
He remains an absolutely vital thinker because he categorically refuses to let us sleepwalk through our existence. He provides the analytical flashlight required to look at the hidden gears and pulleys behind the magic trick of modern society.
So, building on everything we have unpacked today, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to carry with you. Take a hard look at the micro routines of your own daily life.
The next time you sit down to book a highly structured vacation, or you seamlessly curate a streaming playlist,
or you find yourself effortlessly scrolling through a social media feed that is algorithmically engineered to feed you precisely what it knows you desire, pause and ask yourself a question. Are you truly experiencing freedom?
Are you exercising genuine autonomous choice?
Or are you simply Odysseus, tied securely to the mast of the algorithm, passively watching the sirens pass by through the tinted lens of a highly profitable, carefully managed illusion?
It is a profound question, and one that requires constant, active attention to answer truthfully.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Adorno. Keep interrogating the structures around you. Always search for the non-identical in your everyday life. And we will catch you next time.